interpreting, which is a well-known concepts. These are well-known concepts that are used in interpreting. I will start with the supermemes. And the supermemes, what are the memes and the supermemes? What's the purpose of knowing these memes and supermemes? It's actually to conceptualize the phenomenon of interpreting in order to have a concept about how this phenomenon of interpreting is done. Now, interpreting studies have focused on what's called supermemes of interpreting. Supermemes of interpreting. Now, there are three supermemes in interpreting, which are well known, which is first, translation in general. In other words, you need to know something about that it is fundamentally translation, that interpreting can be viewed most fundamentally as translation. And of course, in translation in general, this means that it incorporates the ideas that Chesterman has said in 1997 when he elevates to the status of these five ideas, to the status of supermemes of translation. These are from the supermemes of translation. And the supermemes of translations are the source and target metaphor, the idea of equivalence, myth of untranslatability, and the free and versus literal dichotomy, and the idea that all writing is a kind of translation. This is the first supermem, which is under translation in general. Now the second, there are three of them, of course. Translation in general is one of them. The second one is processing. And that is when you are processing the information in your mind or in the brain of the interpreter. And according to Giles, his concept of interpreting as a processing procedure, if you like, in 1994, when he says it's a process, interpreting is a process, this is the supermemes, the supermeme of interpreting, number two. It's a process, P, acting on an input, I, and producing an output, O. In other words, it's a process where the input is what you hear in your ears, that's the input, and then it goes into your head and you process it, and then you output it while speaking and while you're actually producing the interpreting. The third one is called communicative activity. You have to actually make sure that that activity is communicated well. And that is extremely, extremely important. Communication is extremely important. Under this third supermemes, communicative activity, it is what is very, very important as one of the main concepts under communicative activity. It found that its strong expression in the meme of making sense, and I will explain to you what is making sense later on under memes and not super memes. So now we have finished with the three super memes of interpreting, which are translation in general, process or processing, and communicative activity. Now, if we move on to the memes, which go under these super memes, and these are introduced in order, to characterize the evolution of thinking about interpreting in various periods and disciplinary contexts, and there are very different contexts. The first meme is verbal transfer, and verbal transfer means it's a process in which words in one language are converted into words in another language. So that is the verbal transfer. Of course, Schleimacher, who is in 1813, he has done a lecture, and in that lecture, he says about interpreting that it is. He thinks that the language used in transaction or transacting business was so straightforward as to make interpreting, it becomes like what? It becomes like a merely mechanical task that can be performed by anyone with a modest proficiency in both languages, i.e. language 1 and language 2, and where so long as obvious errors are avoided, there is little difference between better and worse renditions. So in other words, according to Schleimacher, it's just a mechanical thing. It's just an immediate mechanical thing where you perform it so long as you have some proficiency in 2 languages and you don't make any obvious errors in there. If you don't make any obvious errors, and that is when, Schleimacher thinks that there is very little difference between better or worse interpreting. So in other words, interpreting is not better or worse, so long as you are proficient in both languages and you're doing it mechanically as a task. That is, so long as, of course, you don't make any obvious errors here. So the second meme after transfer, actually, another point about verbal transfer, it is actually the idea of a language switching operation. According to Julius Wirl, 1958. He says that it is a language switching operation. In other words, it's like a light switch where you switch from one language to another. So once you start, as I usually advise, that you should only do it one direction if you are doing simultaneous interpreting. So it's like a switch. It's like a light switch. Once you switch it on, you start to move from one language to another. The problem is sometimes some interpreters might mix between languages, and that is when they, for example, when somebody says good evening, and they interpret it as good evening. They don't say Masa al-Khair. And that is a language switching issue. Sometimes it happens with some interpreters. While they are interpreting, they repeat the same word they have heard in their input, in their ear, and they repeat it while they are outputting. So that's the first meme, which is verbal transfer. And this is under, of course, the supermemes. Second one is, the first one, again, another point, this is the third point in verbal transfer, which is basically that the explanation that Wirl has actually said about this, it is the automaticity. Automaticity and inter-idiomatic relations. There is an automaticity when you start. As soon as they speak in one language, you are actually speaking in another language automatically. So that is a mechanical in Schleimacher, but here it is automaticity. You are automatically saying that. And that is very, very important because he's claiming that in the truly bilingual and thus perfect linguistic mediator, i.e. the interpreter who's a mediator, the two languages were interconvertible at all times. In other words, you can convert them from one language to another. All the words can be interpreted or converted into the other language, thus enabling the interpreter, to perform the task as an automatic reflex rather than an act of volition. In other words, you are not really thinking about it a lot. You are automatically reflexing what you are hearing straight away into the action. It's not an act of volition, meaning you are not doing it intentionally. You're just not thinking about it intentionally as much. It's more of an automatic reflex between the two languages. So automaticity is a very important element in Wirl's view. And that is for verbal transfer. After verbal transfer, we have making sense. And making sense, you have to make sense of what you are saying. But Herbert is saying in 1952, for one, he stresses that the interpreter's function of enabling mutual understanding in the service of international communication. So in communication, you are trying to make some mutual understanding between two different entities, if you like, and you are trying to make them understand each other well, okay? And it is actually for the international communication because you're communicating between two different nationals. and that the interpreter's task, according to Herbert, within a particular communicative situation was characterized as combining the activities of a listener and a speaker. So you have to be a good listener and a good speaker. This is how you combine the two elements. So you are good listening and good, very clear as a speaker. You are trying to do that in order to make sense. And that is the second meme out of the 5 memes under the 3 super memes that we talked about earlier. Again, under making sense, Selezkovich, she's a well-known, Dianika Selezkovich, she's a well-known interpreter in Paris. She's got the Paris School. And she says, this is a very important quotation by her. She says, to interpret, one must first understand. So if you don't understand something in the first language that you are listening to, then don't actually interpret. So you interpret only once you understand what you are interpreting. And also each part of each idea should be expressed in a way that it would normally be expressed by a good public speaker. Herbert, 1952. He's saying that you have to be a good public speaker. When you are expressing the ideas, you have to express them and make them being understood in a very, as if you are a good public speaker as an interpreter. So making sense we finished with, and before that we finished with verbal transfer, and now number 3 out of 5, which is cognitive information processing skills. That's what the skills that needs to be enjoyed or being mastered by the interpreter. According to cognitive psychologists, they have hypothesized that there are various mental structures and procedures in the head of the interpreter, of course, these mental structures and these procedures that are responsible for the processing of verbal data. Verbal data is what you speak, the output basically. So in other words, what they are saying, cognitive psychologists, they are saying there's something going on in your mind, there's a structure which is going on in your mind, and there are some procedures which are happening in your mind as an interpreter before you start processing, while you're processing the verbal data that you heard, in order to actually be outputting it. So you hear it, you process it, and that process is in the mind of the interpreter in terms of structure and procedures. And Gerver, which is one of the theorists in interpreting, he defines interpreting task as a fairly complex form of a human information processing. It's a very complex human processing, the information being processed by a human, information being processed by humans. So it's a human information processing, which is what is this one. It's being processed by humans, the information. And this kind of process, this kind of form, involves these 4 different ideas, which are the reception, which is when you are receiving the information, which is when you are getting the input. Storage, you store them in your head. Transforming or transformation, which is you are moving them to another language. And then transmitting them verbally, transmitting the information verbally. So that's a transmission of verbal information. These are the 4 different processes that happens in the mind of the interpreter, which is reception, receiving the information, storage, storing the information, transforming the information into another language, and then transmitting it, transmitting this verbally, the information verbally. And that is really what is happening with regards to this is the 3rd supermem here. Then we move on to the actual 4th one, which is, this is the 4th one, which is text and discourse production. You are producing a sort of a kind of a text, or it's a discourse that you are producing. Herbert, 1952, he says he likened the interpreter to a good public speaker, as we have seen earlier, and then which would suggest a rhetoric as a framework of analysis. So you need to analyze it accordingly, suggesting rhetoric here. Psycholinguists would study the interpreter's output as speech. Psycholinguists, they interpret the output of the interpreter as a speech with attention to some temporal features. Temporal features means timing, like pauses. In other words, you have to pay attention to the speech on the output and see how this output is with lots of things like pauses and the tone of voice and so on. So it's various things relating to the speech itself. Whereas cognitive psychologists focus on aspects of information content. So they focus on the content and the information that you are providing rather than the speech and how the pauses are. And that is the difference between psycholinguists and cognitive psychologists. And this is for number 4. And then lastly, number 5, and this is the last one here, which is mediation. And that means that the interpreter who is professional, whether professional or not, is the man or woman in the middle, according to Knapp and Patoff. And Knapp in 1987, he is an intermediary, or she is an intermediary. Not so much between languages. You are not actually intermediating between languages. You are involved as between communicating individuals. So you are actually sitting with communicating individuals. You are not looking at language only between two languages. You are actually communicating between two individuals or individuals and institutions. And also you need to be aware of the socio-cultural positions they represent. For example, some of the speakers in a conference could be representing a country. So they're representing not only themselves personally, but they are representing a whole society, a whole nation, and a whole culture as well. So you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware that these communicating individuals that you are actually interpreting in between, you are actually communicating, they are communicating according to their position and the position they represent. And that is what mediation is all about. Mediation, again, it's a kind of, when do you mediate? Well, sometimes you might mediate, but that is very, very rare. But that is only in a consecutive, really. In the more critical case of one party signaling a lack of understanding. Let's say one of the parties did not understand the other party properly. So the interpreter's mission of enabling communication is at stake here. If they don't express it well or they don't understand well, then you are at stake here. You have got a problem in the communication. You cannot communicate between them. So you may require some sort of intervention from your end and say, sorry, the other party did not understand what's going on. So you need to actually explain it well to them. And that's the only time where you can actually intervene. So this is really what is very, very important as you are, is that according to Knapp and Patoff and Knapp, is that you have to be, you should not be third party participating. You should not be a third party. Rather, you should remain neutral and invisible as an interpreter. Okay? So this is the problem when you are a lay interpreter. Lay interpreter means that when you are like a friend of somebody and you are just interpreting for them, you are performing some linguistic mediation in a way, because you will be mediating and interacting as well as an active third party, but you should not be. Of course, if you are professional, you should be neutral and invisible. But the lay interpreter, the people who are not professional interpreters, they act like a third party and they start to defend each other. And that is really the map, which is very important for you to remember and memorize, perhaps, is about the memes. And you can see that there is language, cognition, interaction, and culture. But mediation is very in the middle, and of course the discourse is in the middle, but making sense is most important here. And cognitive information processing, which you are doing through cognition, and of course there is a verbal transfer, which you are actually outputting yourself after you transfer it in your mind. I hope that you have got a very good idea about memes and super memes in interpreting, which is very, very important for the interpreter to be aware of them from a conceptual point of view so that they understand what's going on in interpreting. Have a nice day.